Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Brian's Horror Corner, and welcome to this horror movie review for day 24 of my 31 Days of Halloween Horror series. So today we're going to take a look at a movie that was a first time watch for me for this review, and that is 1981's Ghost Story, based on the Peter Straub novel, which I have not read. Um, but I did watch this movie for the first time. I added it to my collection earlier this year, so yeah, I was interested in checking it out for this series. So yeah, let's just go ahead and get into Ghost Story from 1981. So Ghost Story is a 1981 American supernatural horror film directed by John Irvin. Um, Based on the 1979 novel of the same name by Peter Straub. It follows a group of elderly businessmen in New England who gather to recount their involvement in a woman's death decades prior when one of them suspects her ghost has been haunting them. So just by that premise alone, you could tell this is an old-fashioned ghost story. So basically, we're introduced in a small New England town during the frigid winter season of 1979. Four elderly friends, businessmen Ricky Hawthorne, lawyer Sears James, Dr. John Jaffrey, and Mayor Edward Charles Wanderley from the Chowder Society in an informal men's club who get together each week to share tales of horror. Edward's son David, living in New York City, falls from his apartment window after seeing a girl he's been sleeping with suddenly turn into a living corpse. His other son, Don, comes home at Edward's request. Sometime after David's funeral, Edward sees him walking through town during a snowstorm and follows him to a bridge where he disappears. Calling out to his dead son, Edward suddenly sees a female apparition and he falls to his death from the bridge. Meanwhile, two escaped patients from a mental asylum, Gregory and Fenny Bate, have taken up residence in the old Eva Galley house, now in ruins. Doubting his father committed suicide, Don approaches the remaining three friends and tells them a ghost story to gain membership into the Chowder Society. In a flashback, Don tells the story of how he, a college professor in Florida, began a torrid affair with a mysterious secretary named Alma, soon becoming engaged. Alma insisted she wanted to marry Don in his hometown of Melbourne, but he was reluctant as he considered the town boring. Don soon began to suspect that something was wrong with Alma, a gut feeling that was vindicated one night when he touched her and realized she was as cold as a corpse. Don eventually broke things off with the furious Alma, who disappeared from his life. He fell into a depression, costing him both his reputation and his job. So that's kind of the setup and the premise for Ghost Story. As far as the cast goes, we have four classic old school actors. Fred Astaire as Ricky Hawthorne. Melvin Douglas as Dr. John Jaffrey. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. as Edward Charles Wanderley. And John Houseman as Sears James. Also, we have Craig Wasson, who plays both Don and David Wanderley. Patricia Neal as Stella Hawthorne. Alice Craig, or Craig, as Eva Galley and Alma Mobley, and Jacqueline Brooks as Millie Jaffrey. So yeah, that's the setup, the premise, and the cast for Ghost Story from 1981. Um, this is an interesting film. I enjoyed it for the most part. It worked for me. I don't, however, think it'll work for everyone because, especially for people that are more used to modern horror movies or like full blown horror movies, this is much more of an old school 40s, 50s, 60s sort of horror movie where it's much more about the narrative, much more about um just an old fashioned ghost story. You know, it's not big production values and high special effects and gore effects and things like that. Although it does have some nice practical makeup effects in the movie, which I'll get into with my review. Um, you really have to be willing to let a movie play out, let a narrative play out, not expect to have blood and guts and horror around every corner kind of thing. So I just wanted to give you that little prelude before I start on my review here. So, Ghost Story from 1981. Starting with the things that I liked about the movie or my pros. Um, so, the cast. You got to start with the cast. As I mentioned, you have the four classic old school actors with Fred Astaire, Melvin Douglas, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and John Houseman, who three of those four, this was their last on screen movie appearance. Fred Astaire, Melvin Douglas, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., this was the last movie they ever shot. In fact, I believe Melvin Douglas passed away shortly after, like 4 months after they made this movie, or 4 months before it actually was released. John Houseman would be in other movies after this. Of course, they're all passed away now, but and then I'll also, but they all four of those really bring a lot of class to this movie. A lot of great horror performances. In a lot of horror movies, of course, you get young, especially slash movies. You get teenagers, you get young people. But back in the day, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they would have horror movies or suspense movies that had older actors, and I rather kind of enjoy that. Not that I hate horror movies from the recent past that have teenagers. Some of them are really good, obviously, but it's nice to sort of get that old school performance class in there, and these four definitely bring it. They're all four very good, and they're obviously their older years here, legendary actors. Also, I think Craig Wasson and Alice Krige have to be mentioned as well. They're both really good. They both kind of play dual roles in the movie where Craig Wasson, who most people would probably know from Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. I know he's been in other things too. He's in one of my favorite Tales from the Dark Side episodes, the Giesen Stacks. Um, and he's in other movies as well, but he plays a dual role of both brothers, Don and David Wanderley. Um, and Alice Krige, who's kind of she's very important to the movie, obviously, the ghost story. She kind of plays a dual role as well as both Alma Mobley and Eva Galley, and she fits into both sort of narrative told stories, and then obviously the overall main story. Yeah, they all do really good. I think that she does really well. I mean, just her expressions and her she's like really bubbly and smiley 1 minute, and then she's able to change expressions and looks that are really creepy and eerie, and you can just tell there's something not quite right with this woman. And Craig Wasson's really good as well. So, but the entire cast really. You also get Patricia Neal and Jacqueline Brooks as the wives of a couple of the Chowder Society members. They're good in supporting roles. So yeah, there's really not a bad performance here. um, so yeah, that's the first thing that really stands out to me in this movie is just it's I really enjoyed this entire cast in this movie, and they all do a really good job to carry it. I really enjoyed the setup and the narrative the movie uses to tell the story. Well, I don't think this is an anthology movie, which I kind of thought it was going into it. It wasn't quite what I expected. It does have a couple of, I guess, if you really want to stretch it, you could say it's a bit of an anthology movie because there are stories told within the story, but they're more like flashback stories for different characters in the main story, the ghost story, the overall narrative story, if you will. There's basically two sort of look back stories. Obviously, one of them's the big twist of the movie, the big one towards the end. And then Craig Wasson's character gives another one midway through the movie. So, I mean, technically, if you wanted to call it a horror anthology, you could. I'm not going to because it's not. I wouldn't consider this a horror anthology in the traditional sense of the word, like something like Creep Show or um, even Trick or Treat, which all the stories tie in together, which this one kind of does too. But it's just kind of told differently. It's more of a flashback narrative. So, well, I said, well, it's not an anthology movie. I really do like how the movie leads the viewers in and out of different tales that are told by these characters, and obviously they're all tied together in the end to work for this main narrative that's being told as the ghost story, if you will. So, yeah, I just really enjoyed it. It really worked well for me. I also like the New England town setting with the snow and the atmosphere that we get. At one point, it's snowing pretty hard as one of the characters is walking through the streets of this New England town. That was enjoyable. I thought it really added a good backdrop for the overall ghost story here. So good. So I really enjoyed the setting. The practical makeup effects were really effective for me, especially related to the apparitions of the ghost that they would see throughout this movie. Oh, I lost my lighting here. What's going on? Well, I don't know. Must have something to do with outside. But um, mm, yeah, there we go. Sorry about that, guys. But yeah, like the apparitions of the ghosts that the older characters see at various points throughout the movie, those are really good in terms of the effects, the makeup effects. You got a lot of like melting and really creepy with the eyes and just the overall facial effects. That's probably like the horror part of this movie, you might say, when you get those sort of, I don't want to say jump scares. There are a couple jump scares in the movie, but they're more just like the horror elements of seeing this apparition or at the end of the movie and like this old decrepit corpse. But yeah, they did a good job with those effects. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think I have it in my notes who did the practical effects, but I think they're pretty worthy for 80s, which of course had the best practical horror effects out there. I think the characters were all written and introduced well into this movie, giving the viewer just enough of a sense of who these people are, both from the older gentleman to the younger characters. But they give you enough to be engaged in the story and in this movie. I was mostly engaged in the movie. Admittedly, there are some slower parts, which I'll get into in my cons. But because of these four legendary actors, the older ones, the older gentlemen, I was engaged throughout the movie because there's just something, I can't explain it, but there's something about watching world class actors that have been around for like 50, 60 years at this point, and the performances that they're giving towards the end of their career and the end of their life. In the case of a couple of them, that just, I don't know. I'm intrigued by it. I'm really engaged when they're involved in that kind of story, and I think that's what I meant when I said it's nice to see a ghost story, a horror movie that doesn't just have 15 and 16-year-olds that are trying to find their way and don't always have the best acting, but to have actors that have been around the block about 30, 40 times to really bring a lot of gravitas to a movie. And so that kept me engaged, and I think it's going to keep a lot of viewers, especially old school horror movie viewers, engaged in the movie. And then my final pro is, for the most part, it's a pretty well shot movie with solid cinematography, and they also do a good job with like shadow and lighting. I didn't mention also in with my setting, I also really like the house, the abandoned residence of Eva Gala, the house, who's now there's a couple of escaped convicts or like mental institution patient or mental asylum patients that are squatting in this old house. It's just one of those old fashioned haunted house, ghost house kind of settings that I really enjoy as well. And they do a good job in this house with lighting and darkness and giving you some suspenseful scares there as well. So good cinematography and a well shot movie. So yeah, those are pretty much my pros for Ghost Story from 1981. It's not a perfect movie though. Got to get into some cons with the movie. The biggest one for me, and I think other people have mentioned this in their reviews that I've seen. This is a movie where the score and the music that's used in the movie really feels out of place, and it actually takes away from what I think could have been an even more effective horror movie in Ghost Story. They use more of a whimsical kind of score, more of a whimsical music in this movie, and it doesn't really allow the movie to build the kind of tension in certain scenes that I think, as I said, would have made it much more effective and taken it much more seriously from a ghost story standpoint. They do play this movie seriously. There's not a lot of humor in the movie at all. Um, but yeah, that music and that those the score just kind of doesn't allow the viewer to really get completely engaged in the ghost story and the horror of it. Um, I just think they would have been better off using more of a creepy and eerie score, or not having as much music as they do in the movie at all would have even been better. Having some more moments of silence. But yeah, the score and the musical cues really don't work for me in this movie. And I think it does hurt the movie to a certain extent. Doesn't kill it, but it does hurt it. Also, the death of the brother early in the movie, which is like one of the first scenes we get. It's a pretty laughable death in terms of how it's shot. And, he falls backwards out of this window when he discovers an apparition in his bed with a woman that he's sleeping with, and he turns her over, and it scares the hell out of him. And he falls out of this I don't know how many story window, but he's up quite a bit in a high rise apartment. But it's just the way it looks. He's nude, of course, too, which is another thing I'll get into with this movie. But he falls, and it looks pretty ridiculous with the camera work and the effects they use. Again, it's late 70s, early 80s, so I realize that it's a little bit more archaic. It kind of reminds me, although I actually think it's better in Psycho when Martin Balsam's character falls down the stairs. Even that's better than this one. This one's clearly somebody falling down towards like a blue, like a green screen, or like you can just tell that he's falling. The way they shoot the camera, panning, it just doesn't really look that good. It's pretty laughable. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. So the camera work there really wasn't great. That's why I said for the most part in my pros, it's a well shot movie. Also, the pacing of the movie isn't quite as strong as it could be. This is almost a 2 hour movie. It's an hour and 51 minutes. Personally, I think they could have cut 10 or 15 minutes off the movie and some of the middle parts of the movie, but the pacing is kind of a little bit like this. It's I don't know. It wasn't like the worst paced movie that I've ever seen, but it definitely wasn't a strength of the movie as well. I thought it could have been paced a little bit better than it was. Like I said, the movie's a little bit longer than it needed to be. An hour and 51 minutes. I would have liked to have seen like an hour and 35 minutes. I think that might have made the movie a little bit of a tighter package, a little bit more efficient. And then my final con is I wasn't completely sold on why the side character accomplice of I know why Fenny Bate was there, that side character accomplice to the ghost in the movie who's taking revenge, but it just seemed unnecessary and kind of arbitrary to the overall story. I also didn't think that was the one performance that I didn't think was all that well acted either, and I just didn't understand really why that character was there. It just kind of felt tacked on a little bit to me, and it really didn't work for me. So well, the other thing I was going to say about this movie that surprised me the most was the amount of nudity and sex in this movie. Because when you have a movie with these four like old school 70s and 80s actors like Fred Astaire, you're not expecting the movie to have a lot of sex and a lot of nudity in it, but this movie does. And I'm not just talking about female nudity; I'm talking about male nudity. There's one point early in the movie where you actually see a guy's twigging berries, full frontal kind of stuff going on. And granted, it happens fast because he's falling out of a building, but and there's also a pretty. I mean, it's not the most graphic sex scene I've ever seen, but for the time, for 1981, and like I said, just what I was expecting from this movie. Earlier on, midway through the movie, I would say one of the flashback story segments, there's a pretty graphic sex scene going on between Craig Wasson and Alice Krieg. So I wasn't expecting that. And then, of course, there's a lot of nudity with Alice Krieg. You see her like full back nudity, her butt, and also her breasts. I don't remember if you see MILF or if you see her muff or not. But yeah, a lot of nudity, and a pretty graphic sex scene in this movie. So if that's your thing, that might be something you're into. But overall, guys, I enjoyed this movie for what it was. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's an effective ghost story. It's a movie I could see putting on under the right conditions on a cold winter night in mid-January, for just an old-fashioned ghost story with world-class actors and great performances and a narrative that worked for me for the most part. From a story narrative standpoint, like I said, it won't be for everybody. Some people will find the middle parts of this movie kind of boring. It is as much of a mystery and drama at times as it is a horror movie. So just be warned about that. But if you like older horror movies from before the 70s, like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, sort of those psycho vibes, and where not everything's quite as visceral on screen as far as horror goes, then check this movie out. I would highly recommend checking that out if that's the case. So 7.5 out of 10 for Ghost Story from me. Go ahead and comment down below if you guys have seen Ghost Story from 1981, what your thoughts are on it. Do you like it? Do you not? Please like this video and hit the little notification bell down below so you don't miss any of my upcoming reviews for the last week of this series. And please be sure to subscribe to my channel as well so you don't miss any of my great horror content for the rest of this year and beyond. So thank you for watching this horror movie review for day 24, my 31 Days of Halloween horror series. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're having a good October, and stay scared. Bye.